Magnus Carlsen was an unstoppable freight train, and only Alireza Firouzja stood in his way. Magnus had won 9 straight blitz games against the absolute best players in the world without even a draw the day before. The next day, he won 2 and had 2 draws, but he still had not lost a single game. That's when he had to play Alireza Firouzja, the second blitz game they played. And this time, the question is, was Alireza finally able to stop the Magnus momentum? Magnus has white, Firouzja has black. Let's jump right in. Magnus begins with knight to f3, c5, c3, d5, and d4. Sort of a Kali system type opening from Magnus. And Firouzja decides to go ahead and exchange, and this turns into an exchange Slav variation. But usually in an exchange Slav, white will want to delay the development of this knight to f3. So since the knight is already at f3, I think that's why Firouzja decided to just transpose into this. Knight to f6, knight c3, knight c6, and bishop to f4. So far, everything's symmetrical and safe. But here Firouzja plays knight to h5, hitting the bishop at f4 and going after the bishop pair. And this is the highest scoring move in this position. Magnus does not want to give up that bishop pair, so he moves the bishop back to d2. e6 from Firouzja. Now he moves the bishop back to g5. And Firouzja could play the queen to b6. That's a reasonable move. But instead, he plays f6. Kicks the bishop away. And perhaps he can use that pawn to gain some more space in the center. The bishop goes back to d2. And now f5. And we see what Firouzja has done. He has created a stonewall structure in the center of the board with these pawns on light squares. Ideally, he would like to move this knight at h5 back to f6, then to e4. The bishop can come to d6, and he can have a kingside attack. That if everything went smoothly. e3, knight to f6, repositioning the knight. Now bishop to b5, pinning the knight on c6. Remember, Firouzja does have a pretty big hole in his own position at e5. Bishop to d7 to relieve the pin, castles, and bishop to d6. Not only placing that bishop aggressively, but also trying to control that e5 square. Bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6. So Magnus has voluntarily given up the bishop pair to Firouzja. But in these stonewall structures, they tend to be a little rigid and more blocked. And sometimes the knights are even better than the bishops in these positions. Knight to e5, jumping into that weak square, castles, knight to e2, and potentially this knight can jump to f4 and hit this weak pawn on e6. But here Firouzja plays bishop to b5, pinning the knight to the rook. Even he sees that maybe it's better off not to have the bishop pair. Plus, this bishop on b5 is a really bad piece because all of these central pawns are on the same color as the bishop. Rook to e1 to step out of that pin. And now Firouzja has the opportunity to win a pawn. So he's doing pretty well here, and he takes it. He takes the knight on e5. Pawn takes, and now knight to g4. And it's very hard, if not impossible, really, to defend that pawn. If you, say, play f4, then just queen to h4, and you're coming in on the king's side, and white is in big, big trouble. So Magnus goes ahead and gives up that pawn. h3 is played. First of all, Firouzja takes the knight on e2. Rook takes, now knight e5. So Firouzja's up a pawn, but it's important to note that this dark squared bishop of Magnus Carlsen's is quite a bit better than the knight at e5. It's not worth a pawn, but it's not like Magnus is lost here. He's got plenty of play. Bishop to c3, putting the bishop on the nice diagonal. The knight moves. Rook to c1, the only open file. In these exchange Slav structures, the c file is the open file. So Magnus positions his rooks on that file. Queen to d6, and here obviously Firouzja wants to play in the center. And here Magnus plays a really strong move, b4. The idea, of course, is to gain queenside space, perhaps go to b5 and kick this knight away from c6. And it looks like the pawn is hanging. The problem is, if Firouzja were to take the pawn, then queen to d4 attacks the knight and also threatens mate on g7, and Carlsen would simply win in that case. So Firouzja instead plays a6 to slow down the advance of the queenside pawns, a4, continuing their march, rook to c8, now rook e to c2. Magnus has already doubled on the c file, so he's doing pretty well, even though he's still down a pawn. Knight to e7, queen to d4, threatening mate for the time being, so rook to f7 to defend the g7 square. and now b5, gaining space, keeping the knight out of the c6 square, and has the idea that this b7 pawn could become a potential target and weakness in Firouzja's position. Rook to c4 hits the queen, also hits the pawn at a4. The queen moves to a7, where it targets the b7 pawn. Alireza goes ahead and captures on b5, and now knight to g6. That allows the rook to defend b7, and the knight can support an f4 push in an attempt to gain counterplay on the king side. Bishop to d4. Again, we can see this pawn can go to b6, and this b7 pawn can become a real target here. Exchanging rooks. h6, now the king has a little bit of a hiding place on h7. Rook to c8 check, king h7, and now b6. The attempt to encircle the b7 pawn continues. At some point, he could trade off queens and then play rook to c7. And Alireza will have a very tough time dealing with these threats. Plays f4 to gain some space on the king side. Queen to b8, just as we mentioned. Magnus would love to get the queens off the board, then eventually places rook on c7. Queen takes b8, rook takes b8, e5, bishop c5, and now Carlsen is threatening bishop d6, bishop c7, in which case he probably would just be winning. Blocking off this rook's defense of the b7 pawn, he'd just take the b7 pawn and march it forward. fe3, fe3, and now rook to d7. Alireza is keeping that bishop out of d6, so that bishop d6, c7 maneuver cannot be played by Magnus. So now rook to c8 with the idea of going to c7, which the rook would not be able to take it because after the exchange, white could just advance to the queening square. Otherwise, he wins the b7 pawn. d4 is advanced. Now rook to c7, just as we discussed. So how does Alireza deal with this threat? He can't take the rook, and otherwise the pawn is lost. Well, he plays rook to d5. He's counterattacking the bishop at c5, so that if rook takes b7, he would just win the bishop. So ed4 is played instead. ed4, bishop to b4. Now he is threatening to take a pawn on b7, so rook to b5. He continues to chase the bishop. Now he's also threatening to take on b6. The bishop goes to c5. Computers show that bishop to d2 is actually better for tricky reasons, but white can probably defend from this position. But bishop to c5 was played in the game. But the reason bishop d2 was better is because now knight to f4 can be played, and Firouzja's knight becomes quite active on this f4 square. The bishop on b2 would have prevented that from happening. He cannot take the pawn at d4, by the way, because of knight to e2 check, forking the king and the bishop. So instead, he plays the bishop to d6, which attacks the knight on f4. The knight goes to e6, counterattacking the knight at c7. Lots of cut and thrusts in this game. And now rook takes b7. He finally gets his pawn. However, even though Magnus has won that key pawn, all the while, Firouzja has arranged to have a pretty powerful d-pawn himself. And now that pawn begins to advance. Rook to d7, placing the rook behind the pawn. Obviously, the bishop's in the way, but it will move. So Firouzja plays his own rook behind the pawn and also pins the bishop to the rook. b7, d2, and as it turns out, they both end up queening. So the drama continues. Now, king safety. With queens on the board, king safety becomes a really big factor now. Will Alireza be able to finally defeat Magnus after this incredible run? King to h2, rook to d2, and Firouzja is threatening knight to g5, which creates massive threats. Knight to f3 check because the g-pawn is pinned. There's maybe potential sacrifices on g2. If the knight gets to g5, it could be real trouble for white. It will be big trouble. So Carlsen plays queen to c7. Now that defends the g2 pawn, controls the f3 square so the knight can't go there. But also if the knight moves, the g7 pawn will hang to check from the rook. But the downside of that move is it gives up the bishop. So now Firouzja is up an entire piece. But all is not lost for Magnus. He plays the move queen to e4 check, king to g8. And in this moment, he has a way to create a dead-drawn position by playing queen takes knight, check, forcing rook takes queen, and then white would take the queen, And this is a dead drawn position. They would agree to a draw right here in an actual game. But Magnus wants more. He's been on such a long winning streak. He wants to see if he can actually win this position with his well-placed pieces. So instead, he plays rook to e7, hitting that knight, and now the knight goes to f8. So he's given Firouzja a piece and hoping that his queen and rook can create enough activity to win, but that's pretty optimistic. Queen to c4 check, queen to d5. One of the advantages of being up a piece is that all the queen trades favor you. So Firouzja is constantly trying to trade that queen off. Queen g4, rook g6, and g4, white is threatening mate. Rook g6, the rook and queen hit g2. Queen to e2, queen to d6 check, king to h1, and now rook to e6. And this forces trades by hitting the rook and the queen. It's also defended by the knight. Trades are forced. So rook takes, queen takes. Now, Carlsen can't trade queens because the knight ending would be dead lost. So queen to b2, queen to f6. Again, he's trying to trade off pieces. Queen to b3 check, king h7, queen c2, knight g6, king g1, queen d4. And after a few checks, we end up in this position. So how does black win this up a piece? It is not easy. Basically, what he has to do is play the pawn to h4 and create a structure with pawns at g5 and h4 on the king side, and then find some way to get his king up here to attack white's king while avoiding all of the checks from white's queen. A very delicate process, not easy to execute. King to g1, h4. The king tries to move up, offering queens. Now the knight blocks the check because he knows he's going to support that knight with the g5 push. Queen to e3, king to g5, queen to c5 check. Now the king goes back, and he realizes that he needs to advance that g-pawn. Queen to e5, and now he does. So he has this structure in place. Now he's got to find a way to get his king to the front of the board. Check. Now he sort of has a few starts and stops in an attempt to get his king to move forward. But he finally, after quite a few checks, finds a way. Now the king is beginning to make its way towards white's king. Queen to e8 check, king to d4, queen to d8, queen to d5, check, king to d3, queen to h7, check, and now king to d2. Firouzja is threatening mate on g2 with the knight and the queen, and Magnus has no checks. Every check he can deliver, like d3 or c2, he just would be captured immediately. So in this position, Magnus resigned. All he could do was play queen to d7 and just give up his queen for a move, and then he would be mated. And Alireza Firouzja finally stopped the Magnus Carlsen juggernaut and won at the SuperUnited Rapid Blitz. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.